The crack in the earth shouldn't have saved them. It was barely wide enough for a man to turn sideways, a thin black gash splitting the red rock face like something had struck it from below. But inside, cool shadow, the sound of running water, and the glint of turquoise light. Silas Hart pressed his hand to the stone and closed his eyes. 3 weeks earlier, the land had looked like a promise. That was before the wells went shallow, before the bean rows went gray and brittle in the ground, before May started rationing the water barrel with a tin measuring cup. Before Silas understood what the old-timers in Ash Rift meant when they said the desert didn't care what a man wanted from it. It only answered what he was willing to find. They had arrived in late April with a wagon, a mule named Cutter, and $37 tucked inside a coffee tin. The land they'd claimed was a quarter section of high desert south of Ash Rift, New Mexico territory. Red rock and caliche and scattered juniper, with a shallow creek shown on the land office map that turned out to be nothing but a dry channel of pale gravel. Silas had stood over it the first afternoon, hat in hand, squinting at the empty stones. He didn't say anything. May watched him from the wagon seat and didn't say anything either. Eli climbed down and started collecting interesting rocks, already contented. They built a camp the first week, canvas shelter over a frame of cut juniper poles. The wagon pulled alongside for a windbreak, a small fire ring from the flattest stones Eli could carry. Silas spent the second and third weeks turning soil by hand where it was soft enough to turn, working a strip of ground along the dry channel where he hoped water might still lie close beneath the surface. He planted beans, squash, and 2 short rows of corn. May planted a kitchen herb patch beside the wagon wheel and watered it from their barrel each morning with a careful, measured pour. The early weeks were hard, but not frightening. The desert in late April and early May held a clean, dry beauty. The light long and golden at evening, the nights cool enough for a wool blanket, the silence absolute and wide. Eli found a horned lizard and kept it 3 days in a coffee tin before May made him release it. He named it Governor, but by the second week of May, something shifted. The sky became a white glare by mid-morning. The wind came up in the afternoons like the exhale of a furnace. The soil that Silas had turned began to crack. The bean seedlings stood up 4 days and then bent. Then the first 2 rows of squash went limp at the crown. Then the creek channel, already dry, seemed to pull back further into itself, as though the earth were swallowing what little remained. Silas walked the rows each morning before the heat came. He didn't complain, but May watched him, and she could tell by the set of his jaw that he was calculating. How much was left, how long it would last, what happened after. The day the water barrel dropped to its last quarter, Silas decided they would search. Not back toward Ash Rift, that was 4 hours by wagon, and pride was still a factor, though a smaller one each day. He meant east, toward the red rock escarpment that rose a mile from camp, where a few junipers still held their needles green instead of gray. He told May at breakfast. She nodded and began packing a canvas bag. Tin cups, a coil of rope, the last of the cornbread wrapped in cloth. Eli was ready before either of them. He stood at the edge of camp with his hat on straight and his canteen strapped across his chest, looking toward the rocks with the expression of a boy who expected something extraordinary to be waiting there. They left before sunrise, while the air still held the memory of coolness. Cutter carried the empty water barrel lashed to the pack saddle. May walked beside the mule, one hand on his neck. Silas walked ahead, reading the ground. He was not sure this was the right decision. That thought walked with him the whole first mile. The water barrel was nearly empty. Yes, but it wasn't empty yet. They had enough for perhaps 5 days at strict ration. The sensible thing, the thing a cautious man would do, was to load the wagon and go back to Ash Rift, find work at the livery or the mill, let the land sit through the dry season and come back in the fall. But the homestead claim required residence, leave for more than 30 days, and the claim could be contested. Silas had walked every rod of that quarter section in the first week. He knew its rises and its hollows. He had picked the site of the house he meant to build, a low ridge above the dry channel, sheltered from the south wind. He was not willing to walk away from that, and there was something else, something he couldn't say to May plainly, without sounding like a man grasping at nothing. He had been watching the escarpment for 2 weeks. In the early mornings, before the heat bent the air, he could see where the shadow fell long and cool along the base of the rocks. Twice he had seen a hawk circle low there, lower than a hawk circles over bare stone. Hawks follow water. Every man who had lived outdoors long enough knew that. May, for her part, asked only one question on the walk out. If there's nothing there, then we go back to town, Silas said, and we come back in the fall. She was quiet a moment, then, all right. That was May. She did not waste words arguing a thing she had already decided to accept. What she was deciding, Silas understood, was whether she trusted him. He was grateful she had resolved it quickly. Eli asked no questions at all. He walked between them, watching the rocks grow larger, his face open and interested, as though the desert were performing something for his particular benefit. They reached the base of the escarpment as the sun cleared the eastern rim of the plateau, and the full heat of the day began to gather. The rock face stretched 100 feet high in places, cut and folded by time into alcoves and ledges. Silas worked along the base, checking every shadow, every seam. He almost passed it. It was Eli who stopped. The boy put his hand flat against the rock face, where a thin black vertical line interrupted the stone. "Papa," he said, "there's wind coming out of here." Silas pressed his own palm beside his son's. Cool air, distinct and steady, moved against his skin. May came and stood beside them. She pressed her cheek to the stone where the cool air slipped out and closed her eyes for a moment. Just a moment. And when she opened them, something had settled in her face. Not relief exactly, recognition. As though she had suspected all along that the land was hiding something, and this confirmed it. "It goes in," Silas said. "Then we go in," May said. Eli was already sideways in the gap, one shoulder pressing the far wall, working himself forward into the dark. May called him back. He came reluctantly, grinning. The fissure was 18 inches wide at the entrance and opened gradually as they pressed inward. Silas went first with the lantern, May and Eli close behind. The rock walls rose 20 feet above their heads, close enough that he could touch both sides without fully extending his arms. The floor was stone, smooth and flat in places, broken in others. The air cooled with every step. Not the false cool of shadow that lasted only a moment, but a deep mineral coolness that lived inside the rock itself, the same temperature at noon as at midnight, indifferent to the sun overhead. 30 feet in, the passage widened to a rough oval chamber, perhaps 40 feet across, and opened to the sky at the top through a long, irregular slot. The light fell straight down in one pale shaft, and there, at the far side of the chamber, Silas held up the lantern and stopped. A seam in the rock wept water. Not a pour, not a rush, a thin trickle, a living thread of water that caught the light as it ran down the stone face and disappeared into a shallow pool carved into the chamber floor. The pool was perhaps 10 feet across and 2 feet deep at the center. The water was the color of deep sky, a vivid, improbable turquoise, the kind of color that did not seem to belong in a dry land, and yet looked entirely right here, held in the dark arms of the rock. And the fish. Eli saw them first. He dropped to his knees at the edge of the pool and pressed his face close. "Papa, there are fish." His voice was hushed, as though the fish might hear and disappear. Little ones. They were small, 3 to 4 inches, pale and quick, moving in the slow current of the pool with the calm of creatures that had never been disturbed. Silas counted 11 of them in the light of the lantern, likely more in the deep shadow at the far edge. May knelt beside Eli and trailed her fingers in the water. She lifted her wet fingers to her lips. Her face changed. "It's good," she said. "It's clean." Silas tasted it himself. Cold, faintly mineral, clean as anything he had ever put in his mouth. He sat back on his heels and looked at the pool, the weeping seam, the fish, the shaft of pale light from the slot above. He looked at the walls, solid sandstone, sheltered entirely from wind. The temperature inside the chamber was, he estimated, at least 30 degrees cooler than the air outside. He stood up and walked the perimeter of the chamber slowly. The floor was mostly flat. One section of the east wall formed a natural alcove, wide and deep, set back from the pool. The ceiling of the alcove was low, perhaps 7 feet, but level. The stone there was pale and dry. He turned to May. She was already looking at the alcove. She looked at him. "You're thinking what I'm thinking," she said. "It would need a front wall," Silas said. "There's sod outside. There's enough flat stone on the floor in here for a threshold. Ventilation from the slot above. Light, too, in the mornings." Eli stood up and looked between them with the alert expression of a boy following a conversation just above his full comprehension. "Are we going to live in the rock?" he asked. "For a while," Silas said. Eli absorbed this. Then he nodded with complete seriousness, as though they had announced a sound and practical plan, which Silas supposed they had. They spent the remainder of that first day simply learning the place. Silas measured the alcove with his arm span, 11 feet wide and 8 feet deep. May traced the water flow from the seam to the pool and found it ran at a rate she could collect without disturbing the fish's supply. Eli named the pool. He called it the Blue Room, and the name stuck without discussion. The work of making the fisher into a home took 9 days. Silas cut sod from the shaded base of the escarpment where the soil still held moisture and stacked it in rough bricks against the mouth of the alcove, working from the floor up. He left an opening for a door, a low rectangle that required a full-grown person to duck and a 7-year-old to simply walk through. May chinked the sod joints with a mortar she mixed from the pale caliche dust and water from the pool, smoothing it with a flat stone she found on the chamber floor. The result was not beautiful, but it was solid, and it did not sweat or crack in the dry air. For flooring, Silas worked 2 full days, moving the flattest stones from the chamber floor and laying them fitted edge to edge across the alcove. Not perfectly level, but close enough that a cup set down would stay upright. May spread the canvas from their camp shelter across the stone floor for softness and warmth at night. Their bedrolls went along the back wall. Eli's went to the right side, near the wall, where he insisted on sleeping, because from that position he could see through the door opening to where the lantern light played on the surface of the pool. Light was the challenge they had not fully anticipated. The slot above the chamber let in skylight from mid-morning to early afternoon. Good, workable light. but the alcove itself faced west and caught only the reflected glow. May solved it practically. She gathered flat pieces of pale sandstone from outside and propped them at angles in the chamber near the alcove, using them to bounce the shaft of light deeper into their living space. It was imperfect, but it worked. Silas fashioned a lantern hook from a bent nail driven into a sod joint, and they kept the lantern lit at evenings. The mule was the problem they could not solve entirely. Cutter could not pass through the fissure entrance, too wide across the shoulders. They rigged a canvas lean-to for him at the base of the escarpment just outside, in the deep shade of the rock face, where the temperature was tolerable. May carried him water twice a day from the pool in the barrel they had brought on his back. The mule seemed unbothered by the arrangement. He stood in his shade and watched the desert shimmer with an expression of professional patience. The pool required the most careful thinking of all. Silas and May talked it through on the third night, sitting at the pool's edge with the lantern between them while Eli slept. The fish were the heart of it. Those fish had survived because the pool was balanced. Inflow from the seam, slow outflow through a hairline crack in the pool's far edge that Silas found by watching where the level held constant. If they drew too much too fast, they might disturb the inflow pressure or muddy the bottom and harm the fish. If they fouled the water with washing or waste, the fish would die and the water would follow. They agreed on rules, and they were strict about them. Drinking water was collected only from the seam directly, using the tin cup held against the rock face and filled slow. The fish were not to be caught except on days when the food supply ran genuinely low, and then only the smallest of them, from the edges, with a small hook and thread. No washing was to be done in the pool. A separate stone basin outside the fissure was set up for washing, filled from the barrel. The fish, following these terms without being informed of them, continued to thrive. Within the first week, Silas counted 14. The trickle from the seam never diminished. The pool held its level, its color, its cold brilliance. Each morning, when the shaft of light came down through the slot and struck the surface, the whole chamber went briefly, impossibly blue. It was the most beautiful thing Silas had ever lived inside. At the end of the second week inside the fissure, Silas climbed to the top of the escarpment in the early morning and looked out over their quarter section. The land was worse. The bean rows were flat now, brown and papery against the cracked earth. The corn was gone. The juniper trees along the dry channel showed gray at their crowns. The air already shimmered at 8 in the morning. He looked at it for a long time. Then he climbed back down. He did not tell May how bad it looked, but that evening he began measuring the sod walls of the alcove and calculating what reinforcement they would need for a longer stay. July came and the desert tightened. The heat outside the fissure became a physical thing, not weather, but pressure, a dry, relentless force that turned the air white by noon and left the exposed ground too hot to walk on without boots by mid-morning. Silas tested this one morning by setting a tin cup on the open ground and watching the water inside it steam in 12 minutes. Inside the fissure, they were cool. But the world outside was calling in its debts. The first problem was food. The pool fish were a supplement, not a sustenance. Silas had been firm with himself about that. He caught 2 on the worst week of June, cleaned them on the flat stone outside, and May fried them in a dry pan over a small fire of juniper wood. They were white-fleshed and mild, and Eli announced they were the best thing he had ever eaten, which Silas believed was honest rather than polite. But 2 small fish did not feed a family of 3, and their stores from Ash Rift, cornmeal, dried beans, salt pork, and a small tin of lard, were drawing down. Silas began walking the base of the escarpment in the early mornings before the heat locked in, looking for anything edible. He found prickly pear cactus, the pads green and thick with moisture. May had seen them prepared in a camp kitchen south of Santa Fe the previous year, and she knew the method. A flat stone to scrape the spines, slicing the pad thin and cooking it in the dry pan until it softened into something that tasted faintly of green beans. It was not satisfying, but it was food, and there was more of it than they could use. Silas began cutting the pads each morning and stacking them in the cool of the alcove. The second problem was Eli, not a problem in the way of trouble. The boy was biddable and cheerful, the easiest child for a hard circumstance. But he was 7 years old, and the confinement of the fisher, which had felt like adventure in the first weeks, was beginning to press on him. He had explored every inch of the chamber and the passage. He had made friends with the fish, giving each one a name that Silas could not keep track of. He had organized his collection of rocks by color on a shelf of sod May had built for him. He had worn a smooth path in the stone floor between his bedroll and the pool. May noticed before Silas did. She mentioned it one evening while Eli slept. He needs more than this place. There's nothing outside that's safe for him right now, Silas said. I know that, May said, but knowing a thing is necessary doesn't make it easier to bear. Silas sat with that. He had been so focused on the physical mechanics of survival, the water, the food, the walls, the temperature, that he had let himself forget that a child's mind needed tending the same way the body did. He had been providing shelter and food and calling it enough. The third problem arrived without ceremony on a Wednesday morning. Silas had walked up through the fissure to check on Cutter and found 3 men on horseback at the base of the escarpment, watering their horses from a canvas bucket near the mule's lean-to. They had pulled from the barrel. They had not asked. The men were trail dusty and lean, with the look of men who had been on the road too long and were past consideration of formalities. Silas walked out to them at a steady pace, hat on, hands easy at his sides. He greeted them plainly. The tallest of the 3, a raw-boned man with a red beard, looked him over without warmth. Your water? My barrel, Silas said. You're welcome to what you've taken. The man looked at the escarpment, at the fissure opening, at the mule in its shade. You living in the rocks? Staying close to them, Silas said. The men exchanged a look that Silas read clearly. Not menace exactly. Calculation. The kind 3 thirsty men on a dry road made when they encountered a situation that might offer more than had appeared. There water inside? The red-bearded man asked. Some, Silas said. Not more than my family needs. Another exchange of looks. The second man, shorter, with a canvas hat pulled low, turned his horse slightly, casually, in a way that put it between Silas and the fissure opening. It may have been unconscious. Silas did not think it was. He did not raise his voice and did not change his stance. I'd take it as a kindness, he said, if you'd move on and leave us to our camp. Ash Rift is 8 miles north. There's a livery well there, and they let travelers water. The 3 men sat their horses for a moment that felt longer than it was. Then the red-bearded man touched his hat brim, not warmly, but in acknowledgement, and reined his horse away. The other 2 followed. Silas watched them go until they were 200 yards up the road, then turned back toward the fissure without rushing. May was inside the passage, just inside the shadow of the entrance. She had heard everything. She looked at him steadily. They won't be back, he said. You don't know that, she said. No, he agreed, but I think they will. It was the truest thing he had said out loud in weeks. They were not the only ones the drought was pressing. Every man, every family, every creature on this landscape was being pushed by the same dry hand. The fissure was not secret forever. The cool air that leaked from its entrance was visible. You could see the shimmer of it against the heat if you knew what to look for. That evening, Silas moved the barrel inside the fissure entrance, pulling it through the gap with effort and settling it in the passage just inside the shadow line where it was out of sight from the road. He gathered the loose stones from outside the entrance and arranged them not as a barrier, that was beyond his means, but as a visual irregularity, something to make a passing eye skip over the gap in the rock face and move on. May built Eli a small project that kept him occupied and close. A stone map of the chamber floor, laid out on a slab of smooth sandstone with pebbles representing each feature: the pool, the seam, the alcove, the slot above. Eli worked on it with intense concentration for 2 full days. He added the fish with tiny flat stones, one for each, arranged in a rough oval as they actually swam in the pool. It was, May told him sincerely, the best map she had ever seen of any place. But underneath all of it, a quiet weight had settled in the fissure. The encounter with the horsemen had changed the shape of the safety they had felt. The rock walls were still cool, the water still ran, but the world outside had found the edge of what they had built, and it had looked at it with interested eyes. On the first morning of August, Silas went to the seam to collect the morning water and found the trickle slower than it had been. He held the tin cup against the stone and counted the seconds it took to fill. He had made this count every morning for 6 weeks. He knew the number by memory the way he knew Eli's birthday. It was slower, not by much, but by enough. He stood in the blue light of the chamber for a long time, listening to the faint sound of water moving against stone. Behind him, the pool held its level and its color. The fish moved in their slow circles. Everything looked unchanged, but the seam was slowing. He did not tell May that morning. He did his chores, fed Cutter, stacked the morning cut of prickly pear, checked the sod joints of the alcove wall, and he carried the slower trickle inside himself through the whole day. That night, after Eli slept, he told her. She was quiet for a time. The lantern moved in a faint draft from the slot above, and the chamber walls shifted with shadow. How slow? She asked. Maybe a quarter less than last week. Hard to measure exact. The pool level? Holding, for now. May looked at the pool, its still blue surface, the faint motion of fish at the deep edge. Then she looked at the seam, then at him. You think it'll stop? She asked. I don't know, Silas said, and that was the most honest thing he could say. He had no knowledge of underground water, not real knowledge, the kind built from experience. He had a trickle, a pool, and a slowing he could not explain and could not stop. What came next, he did not know. If the seam went dry, the pool would last perhaps a week. After that, they had the barrel. After that, they had nothing. He sat with May in the blue dark for a long time, and neither of them spoke, and the fish moved on beneath the surface, indifferent and luminous. It was May who moved first. She stood up, walked to the seam, and placed both palms flat against the rock, feeling it the way she had felt Eli's forehead for fever when he was small, not to diagnose, but to know. It's still there, she said. It's still moving. For now, Silas said. Then we work with what it is, she said, not what we're afraid it might become. She looked at him over her shoulder. You built this place out of nothing, Silas. We haven't run out of ideas yet. The next morning, Silas began at the seam. He had been collecting water from the face of the rock where it wept, letting the trickle run into the cup. Now he looked at the stone itself, at the line where water emerged, and considered what he knew. Water moved through rock along cracks. Cracks could be narrowed by sediment or mineral deposit over time. He had seen calcium crust on the stones below the seam, white and dusty, from where water had been evaporating against the hot outer air that occasionally circulated down through the slot. He found a thin, flat piece of sandstone and, working carefully, began to clean the mineral deposit from the face of the seam. Not aggressively, not enough to risk widening or damaging the crack, but clearing the crust that had built up over the weeks, the way you'd clear a blocked spout on a rain barrel. He worked for 2 hours, patient and precise. By midday, the trickle was fuller. Not back to its first week's rate, but closer. Distinctly, measurably fuller. He stood back and watched it run and felt something move through his chest that was not quite relief and not quite joy, but something older than either. The feeling of a man who has tried the right thing and found it to be right. May came and stood beside him and looked at the seam and said nothing. After a moment, she put her hand through his arm and stayed. They covered the top of the seam that afternoon with a curved piece of bark stripped from a driftwood log Eli had dragged in from outside weeks ago and stored against the wall. The bark shielded the seam from the downward air circulation, kept the stone face wetter, slowed evaporation, eased the mineral buildup. It was simple. It cost nothing. It had taken them all summer to understand what to do. Eli, watching from the edge of the pool with his feet dangling over the stone, said, "So it's like a hat for the water." "Exactly right," May said. Silas checked the seam each morning after that. The level held. The trickle strengthened by increments over the following days, returning toward its earlier measure. The pool held its color. The fish, 18 now, Eli reported with authority, moved in their settled arcs below the surface. The second change came from May. She had been watching Eli's restlessness for weeks, and she had been watching the chamber walls in the evenings when the light came down through the slot. The pale sandstone caught and held the light warmly, and she had noticed that certain sections of the wall were cleaner than others. The sections behind the pool, where moisture in the air kept the stone surface washed. She asked Silas one evening if the walls were stable. He tested them. Solid, load-bearing, no movement. She spent 3 days sketching on the flat stone of Eli's map with a charcoal stick. What she drew was a window, not through the outer wall of the fissure, which would have opened them to the heat, but upward into the slot itself, using a piece of the flat sandstone mounted at an angle above the alcove's sod wall that would catch the morning light from the slot and direct it down into their living space. Silas spent a day cutting and fitting the stone, wedging it between the alcove's sod wall and the natural rock with smaller stones and mortar. It was not fine work, but when the morning light came down through the slot the following day, it struck the angled stone and threw a broad, warm panel of light directly into the alcove, onto Eli's bedroll, across the stone floor, up the back wall. Eli woke up in a bar of gold light and lay still for a moment, just breathing. "Mama," he said. "Good morning," May said from the cooking corner where she was slicing the morning's prickly pear. He sat up and looked at the light on his hands. "You made it come in here." "Your father did the stonework," May said. "But you knew where to put it," Silas said. She smiled at the wall. The third change was the one none of them had planned. In the second week of August, A thunderstorm came out of the south and broke against the plateau with a sound like a freight wagon on a stone bridge, long, rolling, tremendous. Rain fell for 4 hours. They heard it from inside the fissure as a hiss and roar muffled by the rock, and they stood together at the entrance, watching the water sheet down the face of the escarpment and run in red rivers across the desert floor. Silas walked out in it. He stood in the open with his hat off and his face up and let it fall. Eli was beside him before anyone had decided anything. The boy put his face up the same way and laughed with his whole body. May came and stood in the entrance, one hand on the stone, and watched them. When the rain stopped, 2 hours before dark, the dry channel south of the escarpment ran with a thin rust-colored current. Not much, but real moving water. The air had dropped 30 degrees. The desert floor, still cracked, seemed to breathe. Silas came back inside dripping and grinning, which was not a thing May had seen from him in some weeks. He looked at the chamber, the pool, the seam, the alcove with its panel of morning light, Eli's map on its stone slab, the fish in their slow arcs below the blue surface. "We'll be all right," he said. May looked at him. "I know," she said. "I knew that in June." September brought a change in the light. The sun dropped south, and the shaft through the slot struck the pool at a new angle in the late afternoons, turning the water a deep amber gold for 20 minutes each day before fading. Eli called it the evening show and refused to miss it on principle. The seam ran steady. The fish were 23 now, by Eli's count. On the first cool night of the month, the three of them sat at the pool's edge and watched the light die across the water. Silas had his arm around May. Eli sat with his feet over the stone edge, absolutely still, watching the fish move through the gold.
Thank you so much for watching the story through to the very end. It genuinely means more than I can say. I hope it kept you warm for a little while and maybe carried you somewhere far from wherever you are right now. If it moved you or stayed with you, please consider giving the video a hype and leaving a comment below. I'd love to know where in the world you're watching from. Every single one of those comments amazes me, truly, because these stories travel to places I never expect. If this is your first time here, welcome. I'm really glad you found your way. There are plenty more stories on the channel whenever you're ready for another one. And if you've been here before, thank you for returning. It means everything. If you know someone who loves a story with real heart to it, sharing this one with them is one of the kindest things you can do for the channel. I'll see you in the next one. Take good care of yourself.